Welcome to Conversations with John Harper, More Than Meets the Eye, which is part of an ongoing series. My name is Rez Huseyin. I'm a student of the Diamond Approach, a spiritual path that I discovered through my work with the Enneagram. And I'm joined by John Harper, Diamond Approach teacher, Enneagram guide, and author of 3 books, most recently, Nurturing Essence, A Compass for Essential Parenting. So, object relations. So the average Enneagram student is aware that their type uses or experiences or has a primary object relation. I think that's so wonderful that the Enneagram has made that possible, but they have no context for applying that information to their development. Whereas the student of the Diamond Approach has the developmental perspective, but they don't necessarily have the knowledge of the Enneagram about primary object relations. So what is an object relation? Object relations are fundamental internal templates that form very early on in development that pattern how we relate to the external world. And there are 3 components to an object relation. There's a sense of self, a sense of the other, and an affect between them. And the major giveaway that we're in the territory of an object relation, or when one is active in our experience, is when we're in some sort of familiar or repetitive situation with someone or something. And it's usually the negative experiences that we notice, although, as we will see, negative affect isn't inherent to an object relation necessarily. So in the Enneagram and in the Diamond Approach, we focus on 3 main object relations. The central one, which is also called attachment, at least in the Enneagram world, the frustrating object relation, and the rejecting object relation. And the words themselves don't tell us much, because each of these affects can be experienced in myriad ways. Frustration, for instance, can be experienced as chronic disappointment. Rejection can be experienced as withdrawing or withholding the self. So each of these object relations operates in all of us, as in all of the 9 types, but 3 Enneagram types favor one, 3 another, and 3 another. And if your mind is blown about how things can be that neat and tidy, I share that. I was very incredulous about this for years. And it is hard to believe until you see it in evidence over and over again. So the theory goes that 3, 6s, and 9s, for them, the central object relation is primary. For what type 1s, 4 and 7, frustration is primary. For types 2, 5 and 8, rejection is primary. I've just got a little more to say here, John, and then I'm going to turn over, but it helps to consider the ego ideals or the core self-images for the types. If you're confused about how it is that we can favour one object relation, because as you contemplate the self-images, it becomes quite easy to see which object relation unit would uphold all of that. And you can read Keys to the Enneagram if you want to know what the core self-images for the types are. So finally, from the perspective of the Diamond Approach, developing freedom from object relations isn't about having better relationships or a better life, but to become a real human being. So a person who is able to make contact with the external world from being rather than through the templates. And the very beginning of the development work is becoming aware of when an object relation is active and inquiring into it. And we inquire by exploring those 3 components. Who are we taking ourselves to be? How are we seeing the other? And developing a clarity about that. And then in terms of the core object relation for the Enneagram type, it may be that offers a doorway or a gateway into unraveling that core identification with the self-image of your type. I don't know. That's up in the air. So, John, before we talk about essential space, is there anything in what I said, is there anything that it brings up in you?
Well, yeah, a couple things came up. One, I didn't know about the object relations, there being a triadic relationship to Enneagram types. So I find that interesting, and I need to look into that a little more because my first response is that four would be more of the rejecting object relation, but I can see the frustration. Anyway, I hadn't thought of it. It would be interesting to let my mind roam in that territory. Here's the thing that comes up is object relations are simply one of the ways the mind organizes information. And the mind organizes information to conserve energy. And the mind knows by comparison, this is like this is like this. Every experience we're having as we develop our mental capacity is about, oh, this reminds me of this is like this. And that's the kind of knowing that unfolds from the comparative mind. I think it helps to understand that the first defense of ego is splitting. It's not a conscious thing. It actually has its roots in biology, where the organism tends to gravitate toward pleasurable experiences because they're life affirming, whereas negative experiences are felt as not necessarily threatening to life, but they're not necessarily life affirming. So we split. We have a preference for good and pleasure over bad or suffering. That's critical when it comes to object relations. That is operating underneath everything. So when our mind is comparing experiences, one of the first things that is happening is paying attention to that split. I like this, I don't like that. I want more of this, I don't want that. And we know that the mind, the human brain, has a bias toward the negative, which again is based upon survival. The organism is always perceiving, interpreting perception for the survival of the organism, which tends to put itself into paying attention to what's not right here. So that comes up is splitting in the pleasure principle, in the fact that our psychology is an extension of our biology. Its basis is organic because this is one organism, and it's useful and very supportive to be able to separate our psychology and explore it. But we lose something in that. The way that science has divided up the human experience into these different categories uh, has contributed a lot to human understanding and easing suffering. But at the same time, it dismembers what we are. Now, there can be comparison. My mind can be saying, "Oh yeah, I this situation is familiar to me," but it's the identification with the object relation that's the issue, like everything else. The identification with the personality or the false self or the structured self, however you want to see that, that's the issue.
Mm.
When we're not functioning from that false or that created self-referencing that's coming back to the ego, that self-centeredness, toward my identification as this personality, as this constructed self. There's just the simplicity of being with what's unfolding, and I can so here's what's happening, is we're going to talk about space. It's not so I am experiencing the affect of what I'm talking about, and there is a tendency to just want to be in the space of it or the experience of it. And talking about rejection, it's not that I want to reject the experience that we're having. I don't feel any kind of movement toward that. It's more like the gravity of stillness and space is becoming more dominant, and it's quieting my thinking process. So there's more development needed to be able to walk and talk and chew gum at the same time.
I can really sense it, or at least I feel I can sense the quietening and the spaciousness. And yeah, it is challenging, hey, to come and then discuss rejection in close terms. But then let's speak about space then first. What is essential space? I myself still find it difficult to discriminate space as distinct from the black quality.
Well, I've never thought about being able to define space. But you point to something very interesting. Our normal understanding of space has to do with it within the three-dimensional world. Okay? Like there's space in this room, there's space between me and the telephone pole or the tree I can see or things like that. So space in that regard has distance. But there's an internal space also that we deal with as human beings. And there's bounded space, like you're in my space, you're crossing my boundaries. Right? So if we inquire and explore into all these different variations of space, we will see that our sense of space starts opening up to something that is more fundamental, that doesn't have to do with space-time, doesn't have to do with dimension. It really has to do with that side of the coin of reality that has to do with non-being or absence or emptiness of content. Okay? And that's one of the big questions that science deals with, which is, before the Big Bang, was there space as we know it? Was space created with the Big Bang? Of course, there's controversy now about, was there a Big Bang, or were there many Big Bangs? Right? That it's just universes within universes, the multiverses, bubbling up everywhere. So, to tell you the truth, I don't think I'd be able to articulate space, but I know it. And I think everybody would know it if they spend any time in this type of work. It tends to discriminate and illuminate itself. But since it is something that is beyond content, then I don't know how you would articulate it with words.
Maybe that is one of its defining features. I can really remember the teachers in my home group when they gave the teaching on self images and space. I can really remember the incomprehension that swept the room. It seemed like it really felt like none of us could grasp, because you remember there are four types of space, John. Do you remember that teaching? You've probably had it many times, I don't know. Like the clear dense space and yeah.
Clear space, uh, dense space, clear dense space, black clear space, black dense space. One has to do with the mind and one has to do with the body identification. But
Oh, this is going to be fun. This is a fun topic to. So let's speak about. Maybe I can just attempt to say some words about why we're talking about space, because the object relations camp out where space used to be. Space is the ground of the mind. This sort of non-deficient emptiness of content.
see, that's very important. That's a very important point.
Mm.
Very important point. Because to the ego, uh, the ontological space, the ground of appearance where things come from, the absence, the non-beingness, is felt as deficiency. And that deficiency, and we talked about that when we had the little target and the arrow, that is something that is central to the ego's activity of defining itself and staying active. Its activity is all geared towards staying away from that deficient space, uh, because it feels so bad to the ego structure. But if you drop below that reaction to it, there's a deeper, more intense reaction, which has to do with the fear of annihilation, because that is the power of space. Space at its phenomenological underpinnings dissolves psychic structure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, uh, see, that's the total difference between uh, what you might call personal growth work, self-help work, all of the work that the ego is constructing toward the future to improve itself, to become spiritualized or whatever. All all of that work is a movement away from that space in the ground of being. Whereas real spiritual work is not about getting something as far as grokking it. Ooh, I understand this, so now I'm spiritualized or enlightened or whatever. Okay? Real spiritual work is about watching what we've taken ourselves to be disappear and seeing that, experiencing. When I say seeing, I mean uh, phenomenologically experiencing that something's still here. Awareness is still here. Consciousness is still here. Existence is still here. Dynamism is still here. And it's always been here. These elements of what we are fundamentally is still here. But this self-reflection about this image, this body, my history, all of that is not operating. There's just perception of what's going on in this moment. There comes the experience of space as a non-local phenomenon. Okay? Meaning that the experience is that you are the space, which means you're not only everywhere, but you're permeating everything, and yet that has no extension. And yet it is everywhere if you're in an extensive world. So it brings, it's part of the experience of like, be here now in the moment. There's just this. I don't know, this might be getting a little too woo woo.
No, this is great. This is advanced sort of realizations of space, but you know, like at the very early the beginnings of realizing essential space is just feeling more literally more spaciousness in your mind, more spaciousness in your heart, as in terms of more space around your reactivity, more space. But you know what? This is making me think of something I've been meaning to ask you to do with loneliness, so or aloneness. So freedom from object relations, as you're hearing from John, it's not all rainbows. It involves a confrontation with emptiness, and as John says, the ego wants to make that deficient, that emptiness, and then also more and more aloneness.
You know, Rez, as you talk, it really excites me. And it's weird because you're talking about loneliness and aloneness and all of those are very challenging experiences for every Enneatype type. We all have our flavor of it. But see, talking about space, and this is the difference between the ego's orientation and the beingness of the soul itself. Okay, like if you're when we begin to explore these underpinnings of ego structure, not just object relations, but these existential crises of the self, of loneliness and aloneness and pain. Like I did a 2-year inquiry one time because I became interested in what is pain. Not what is pain if I hit my thumb with a hammer, but what is spiritual, emotional, psychic pain. And that was a very fruitful exploration. And I don't give people the answer because I think everybody needs to take the trip,
So
themselves.
you did discover some interesting things in those 2 years, I imagine.
Yeah. And the answer is very simple. But you see, when you start talking about aloneness and loneliness, God, I got excited. That's the soul. Like, yeah, it gets the sense of exhilaration. Okay. Now I can guarantee you that wasn't there when I first started exploring those things, right?
Mm.
There was the ego response, which is, oh, you talk about loneliness. Oh, it brings up object relations around loneliness, history with loneliness, and a misunderstanding, a linking up of loneliness with aloneness, which creates a lot of confusion, especially if we're in the realm of talking about the spiritual depth of what we are, which is a state of what is often termed alone with alone. Okay? But there isn't loneliness in that experience. There's just pure existence with itself, and a absence of content. If you're into the void or sunyata or emptiness or absence or non-beingness, that type of thing. So there's this crystalline purity to that state, and the experience of the dynamism within that emptiness is off the charts. You're in a place where the pure potentiality and infinite possibilities of reality exist. And that space is, we talk about it in terms of like being black, luminous space, but it isn't a color black, which can be a little confusing to the mind. But that's the best approximation that the mind can come up with of the experience. And yet it is both. It's both this black space and this clear space at the same time. It has both. So there's this crystalline type purity to it with this immensity of potential and possibility and dynamism within nothingness, within space, and it's thrilling, you know. It is what I call, and I think others have referred to as, it's the quickening of the soul, because the soul is responding to like being on the ground at the foot of the revelation of anything and everything. And the whole point behind all of this goes back to that saying, I was a treasure longing to be known, so I created the universe to know myself. And it becomes so absolutely clear at that point, so to speak, that what you are is the lens that reality is looking at itself through.
Mm.
Because you are reality. Yeah. And it's thrilling to the soul. This is one of the fun, infuriating, frustrating things about human beings to me, and I include myself in that. I'm at the front of the line. Okay, so how the mind thinks it can know this, and part of the issue is we have experiences or taste, and then the mind thinks it knows something. Okay? But the memory of the experience of that type of space isn't that space.
Mm.
It's a memory, and it's a this vehicle that we live in, this body mind, it has limitations. And so when we experience reality through the lens of the body mind, it is interpreting that experience within its limitations. And we know a lot about those limitations just from science, neuroscience and cognition and all of that stuff, where our eyes can only see like a millionth of the electromagnetic spectrum. So there's all kinds of stuff out here we can't even perceive. Okay. We know that the mind is filtering out so much of what we're perceiving so that it doesn't go crazy. It isn't just living in this chaos, right? So it's the same thing. You have an experience of space or one of these essential qualities. One needs to keep in mind this is the body's interpretation of being under the influence of this quality.
Mm.
Okay? It's not the quality itself, it's how it shows up and expresses itself through the body. Okay? And yet, it is possible for a human being to perceive the experience of the soul. And that becomes an experience, a discriminating experience of you're experiencing the medium of the soul of consciousness itself, and a form within it, a content experience within the soul itself. And you're aware at the same time of how the body mind is filtering and interpreting and rendering that experience. And there's this experience of acknowledgement and recognition that, yeah, it's doing the best it can, but that's not this. That is a rendering of this at the best approximation the body mind can give you.
Something I forgot to say earlier is that in the three components of the object relation, the sense of self and the sense of the other are interchangeable, in the sense that with the frustrating object relation unit, sometimes our sense of self is being hungry and desiring, and then on other occasions, in other situations, in other relationships, we ourselves are the yummy object.
I think people need to know, first of all, that when it comes to object relations, okay, these are being formed when we're very young. Okay? And there's a whole uh, predecessor to object relations, which is called partial object relations, because there's no concept of even a little self yet, some kind of integration. There are just contractions in the nervous system or the muscles that are laying down the building blocks of object relations. Okay? So, because we're little when these things get formed, most generally, when object relations get triggered, we're small and the other is big. Okay? Now, there is a strategy that, the mind deals with either or. It has a very simple thing. It's either this or it's that. Right. So a reaction to, from some personality types, and this is true within each personality type, but depending on the object relation, they may stay in the small mode, or as a reaction to that, they may inflate themselves and become the big one in the relationship. And that's obvious in the 8 personality structure, where it inflates itself, becomes grandiose, becomes bigger than things, and it identifies with the big one. And then it goes through a world populated by all these little pain in the ass things called people, right? Or situations or whatever, you know. But see, that's part of the work. If you take the 8, is to reconnect with the more primary object relations where it's small, and to experience the impact of that upon itself. On itself is that identity, that ego identity. That's tough to tolerate. So working with an object relation is a way that gives one almost a mechanical way to dive deeper under this functioning self, this Enneagram patterning that I think I am.
Let's talk about affect. So, particularly with the frustrating and the rejecting object relations, when to the extent that I can get in touch with what's going on for me when the frustrating object relation unit is active. There's a deprivation that I can only sort of nibble on for the moment, John. That's I
But
can't
see,
get close to it.
you're speaking to the exact formative ground of the whole thing. The frustrating object relation is tied to our biology.
Mm.
Okay, it is what happens in our nervous system when things are kind of out of whack. When you look at an infant that's hungry, okay, and it's
Yeah.
not getting food, if it's on the breast and it's not getting enough milk from mother and it's voracious, it's getting frustrated. And as we've talked about before, frustration over time will turn into anger. And you can see the kid, it doesn't even know what anger is yet, but it is displaying it in flying colors,
Mm.
and you can see the aggression coming out and, biting the nipple and, I'm going to eat my way through that, even though I don't have teeth yet, whatever. Okay, and everything in that first part of life has to do with feeding and with the whole what do they call it, the alimentary tract, from the mouth to the anus and the movement of all of that. And if you get a child that is has gas
Mm.
or is a little constipated or whatever, you can see the charge in the nervous system, you can see the frustration. Okay. So the frustrating object relation builds on that. It
Mm.
builds on a relationship of that type of early biological experience in life that has to do with feeding, digesting, and shitting, or peeing or whatever it is. And is that happening smoothly, or is there some kind of uh, some kind of issue happening or whatever? And right there you can see that those are bad experiences. I don't want them. I'm separating them in myself as far as I want to deal with that. There's an organic movement to leaning away from
Mm.
that type of experience. And I like it when I get that milk and it's just so sweet and I go, and I bliss out and disappear. I prefer that, you know. So my my ego is tied to my biological movement between pain and pleasure, like that frustration. Now when it comes to the rejecting object relation, okay, it, this is why the book uh, The Enneagram World of the Child starts with a chapter on acceptance,
Mm.
because we're born into a world where our parents can't see us as we are in our nature. And at first, we are kind of oblivious to that, but we're developing quickly, right? And we start to perceive, and this is the whole point of that book, that we live in this soup of our parents' personality types, and it's influencing us. I just read that. It's like the weather system we're living within. you know we're living in a cloudy day or a sunny day or whatever it is, and we're responding to that. Well, part of what we're responding to is because our parents are identified with their egos and with their personality types, they are seeing us through different lenses, and they are looking at their dreams and hopes and wishes and their conditioning around this is what a human being is, this is what parenting is. All of that is forming a very narrowness, constrained environment around this being that just showed up, from this unlimited space that's not of this world, right? So we start picking that up as we're not acceptable. I need to change. Okay. And that is experienced as rejection. I'm not okay. I'm not being met. I'm not being seen. Okay. And the ego itself, its primary movement is rejection. The ego is never in the now. It can't exist in the now. The now will dissolve it, disappear that structured self. So the ego is always, uh, whatever its experience is in the now, it is looking to improve that experience, to change it in some way. It never rests in the now. It never goes, oh, this is so great, you know, kick back and have a beer with a lime on the beach or whatever. Even when we're doing that, you see, there's this very subtle thing going on, which says, I prefer this to suffering.
Mm,
There's a rejection in that.
yeah. Frustration, sandpaper state, rejection. You've spoken about how that happens very early on. Let's maybe just talk a little bit to round it out about the central object relation unit, because this one must get less of our attention, because when the central object relation is active and things are good, it's back to what you said, because of the pleasure principle. Why mess with that? But we do want to mess with that, don't we, John? We do.
I want to leave mine.
You okay, so maybe not. Um,
Well, you see, that is going back to, yes, this division between good and bad, this split, and
mm,
we want the good. And when our personality, our ego type is experiencing the good, why mess with it? That's what we've been efforting our whole lives, to accumulate this storehouse of goodness and stay away from the other thing. But in working with object relations, when working, your work is mainly around the frustrating and rejecting. It's around, okay, here's what's happening, but that's not what's happening. That's what you're seeing, is the past being projected onto the present. So that's not what's happening, you know. So we need to discriminate, like, what's really happening from my interpretation of what's happening. And my interpretation is coming from this overlay veil of the past. And like I said, in one of these previous ones, the one of the ways the mind organizes information is through affective nuclei, which is one of the primary triggers of object relation. It's the charge, it's the affect of what's happening in the moment that is dragging the object relation out of retirement into the present moment, right? So working with that type of process, which is a positive movement and benefits anyone that's doing self growth work, or working with their personality or Enneagram type, helps you to get under the hood of it, deeper into the forces that are at work. That's a good thing. And in doing that, we're increasing all kinds of capacities uh, that exist naturally in the soul, but are not coming through in the natural radiance and potentiality of what they are. It's getting veiled or distorted through the personality. So in doing the work on object relations, we're starting to clarify the structure itself. We're starting to polish the mirror, okay, so that more of our essential nature can shine through. And in doing that work, it becomes we have experiences of kind of our nature breaking through.
Mm.
And we have experiences of, oh, I've experienced this before, but I thought it was just like, I called it like a peak experience or a flow, and I enjoyed it, but nobody was there to help me really get into it in a way that I could discriminate that this isn't like a fundamentally an emotional experience or something that my mind likes. This is something from a different dimension of reality, which has to do with the dimension of the soul or reality and what I really am. So you start being able to have these experiences that you're discriminating the ego's experience and the ego's attempts to approximate reality and a moment of reality itself. Right? In those moments of experiencing yourself free of the structure, or at least having more transparency to your nature, okay, that that triggers a very interesting response of the ego, which is, I want more of that. That's the ego's response. I like that. I want to be more me, right? But then it goes around trying to come up with strategies and doing things to have more me, have more of my essential self, which is just more of the patterning working out, right? But those experiences help to bring to the foreground the innate pleasure and majesty of what it is that we really are. And when I land in my central object relation, which is all my good experiences, I experience myself being contained and contracted. What I really am is still contained and contracted within the world of self images.
Mm.
Part of me wants to be free of that. I mean, what I am is free of it,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm taking myself to be this personality that has this good side to it. And that's what I want. That's what I've been working on. And when you come at it from the viewpoint of the person, why would I give that up? I mean, it's pretty simple from the perspective of the ordinary mind and personality. Why would I do this painful work and suffer and head toward annihilation and dissolution, which scares the shit out of me? You know, why can't I just continue building this wonderfulness and living here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've been trying to do that our whole lives.
Mm.
That's the whole movement. And underneath it all is this sense of there's still some kind of incompleteness. There's something that's not whole. There isn't permanent satisfaction in it. You know, there's some kind of deficiency in it that's motivating the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's always going to be there because the very structure itself, those elements of deficiency and impermanence, and those type of things are inherent to ego itself. Okay? You can't be an ego structure and experience reality. You can't be identified with it. The structuring, some of the structuring can be there, okay? But the whole point is that structure becomes transparent. And and you can't try to fool reality by thinking, well, I'll hang on to all my ego wonderfulness and just be transparent and come up with some idea or image of all that.
Mm.
That's like going to the tip and getting sour milk. Right?
Well, I'm happy with that. I mean, I think that's the developmental work with object relations. That's the developmental perspective in a nutshell, isn't it? I mean, obviously, Diamond Approach students spend years um, looking at our object relations, re-examining them in the light of the different essential qualities. But
Well,
I think,
that's what, that whole series of articles about. You can spend your whole life doing that and never get anywhere. You get a little somewhere, but you're not going to move the needle in the most ultimate way.
let me thank you, John. I must confess, I was getting quite distracted by working out the what your shirt says, and I've got it. I finally got it. It says transcend the bullshit. It's very clever the way they've done that. Is that a company? Is that
This thing has been in my closet. I don't know when I bought this, but I put it on this morning. I saw this. I didn't even realize that. Oh yeah, that is what that says. I
yeah,
just thought it was some kind of Celtic thing when I put it on at 5 a.m.
exactly, me too. But
Huh?
it's very clever. No, I didn't immediately see it either. It's
Well,
cool. Transcend the bullshit. I'm gonna try and find one. Find a shirt that I can buy that says
hey,
that.
that's the whole work of object relations.
Yeah, but that's true. It's a very apt shirt for the topic. But
Yeah, and that is, you might consider that just a novelty or whatever, but that's how true nature works, right? Because I went to get a different
Mhm.
shirt to put on because it was kind of cool, and I saw this, and I thought, well, you know, did I buy that? When did I buy it? That's been, yeah, and I just put it on, right?
Yeah.
But you see, I think that is a way of true nature working,
Hmm.
that it is, showing up like transcend the bullshit. There's a
Mm,
message in that's being carried out, not from a conscious place.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it certainly absorbed me for a while. But thank you, John. We'll call time on object relations for now. Any questions, feel free to post them in the comments.